The last time we looked at one of the ways of mixing tracks called bouncing. This one looks at the other way called Mixdown, and then onto the final stage, which is optional, called mastering. I'll just recap the differences between bouncing and Mixdown. These are two different processes on this machine, but they do very similar things. They both allow you to mix tracks together with effects if required, and also mix in additional live input signals such as external effect returns, again adding more effects, and record the final result to the SD card. And the difference is that bouncing records the mix to a spare track, whereas Mixdown records the mix to a special file, confusingly called the master file. And you can use this file, your Mixdown mix, for just playing back on the machine as is, or you can transfer it to a computer for further processing or burning to a CD. Or you can add more specialized effects and record the result back to the SD card. And this last process is called mastering. But note that it will overwrite the master file. The same file is used for both Mixdown and mastering, which probably explains why they describe it as the master file. I would have preferred a more generic name, or better still, two separate files. Anyway, the art of mastering is outside the scope of this tutorial, and although the effects are tailored for this purpose, some would argue that unless you have the right ears and skill, you should maybe get a professional to do this step for you. But there's nothing to stop you using the mastering effects how you want. And they don't have to be used with a mix as such, and I'll look at the options later. So if you want to use the mastering effects, you have to go through the Mixdown process first. Although, as mentioned before, you don't need to mix using Mixdown. You can mix using bouncing and then pass this track through the Mixdown process in order to create your master file. So I would still recommend considering bouncing with all its advantages before you go down the one-way path of Mixdown. Okay, so how do you mix down? Well, first off, there's no need to select up front which tracks and which inputs you're going to mix. They are all candidates. There's also no need to define a destination, as it always records to the master file. Now, as with bouncing, you have to change modes in order to reroute the signals for Mixdown, although the change is a lot less dramatic. The stereo bus is used, as with live mixing, but in Mixdown, the output signal after the stereo fader is simply routed to the master file. This means any signals which are on the stereo bus will be recorded, as well as going to the outside world. Your original track recordings are left intact, so you can mix as many times as you like without any danger of overwriting your original tracks. I'm using a few tracks here from an old MIDI-based project, and just as an aside, this machine does not have MIDI sync, but whether or not that's a showstopper really depends on the type of music you're dealing with and how long the tracks are. I've always got away with just lining up the tracks using a short note or a pulse at the start of each track, which you can do using the track edit functions on this machine, like move and paste, and then relying on them not drifting too much. Anyway, you enter Mixdown mode by pressing this Mixdown mastering button. The button flashes and the screen says Mixdown. So you set up your tracks, your inputs, any effects you want. If you've not already done so, you can press play to check. And when you're ready, you press record. There's one catch here. Unlike bouncing, you must define the start and end times for the mix before pressing record. It's these in and out points here on the screen. Even if you want to mix the whole song and not just a subset, you still need to set them. If you leave them at their default values, I'll just reset them. Both zeros, and press record, you'll see truck too short, which is a nice cryptic message. You need to have at least 4 seconds between these two values. So we'll locate to the start point. That's my sync pulse. Right, track 11 is my first track. If you select it and use jog play, you can see a graphic of your particular track and set your start point up from here. The play point is in the middle, so 7 seconds is this middle point. So if I set that, press and hold mark set, press and release in, that's done. And the end, I think it was about 3 minutes. We'll just go there for now. Out point 1:59. Okay, now we can press record. There's no need to rewind. You see it jumped right back to the in point, and it's now recording the mix file. Now it stops automatically when it reaches the out point, although you can override this and stop it manually, in which case you'll just get a shorter mix. It's still a valid recording. Now while it's recording, you can adjust track faders on the fly, just like you can with bouncing. But this time you can also adjust the EQ, the pan and the sound controls. Now you might think this doesn't work because if you press mixer, nothing happens. But the shortcut that we covered earlier is the one to use. And this means you must select the track or the source before you turn any of these knobs. And then the pop-up window appears. And these knobs will then apply to the selected item. Now like we saw with bouncing, where the bounce bus went through its master level control, the stereo bus goes through this one, the stereo fader, before it reaches the master file. So you can adjust this to control the overall level of your mix. Maybe give a nice smooth fade in and a fade out perhaps. You can see it stopped automatically at the out point. If I do it again, I just press record, you'll see it goes back to the beginning and it's now mixing again. These levels in the meter bars show the signal levels coming out of the SD card. Now these will be your original recorded levels. They are not affected by the track faders. If I put all these down, the meters are still going. So the only metering you have for the mix result are the monitor meters on the far right of the screen. And as we've also seen before, the monitoring point is after the stereo fader, and the monitor select needs to be set to stereo. So if you see and hear nothing, these are the first two things to check. And this is one reason for these videos being in the possibly strange order they are. If you're not comfortable by now with which faders control which signals and what the meter bars are actually showing, you could end up with poor mixes, either too quiet or too loud and distorted. So if you skipped over the early videos, now's the chance to revisit them. Now here's one of the catches for mixing down. There is only one master file for each song. If you've recorded several songs all in one pass and now want to mix them separately, you might think you just have to set the in and out times for each slice and mix. But this will overwrite the master file each time. One solution is to avoid the situation in the first place and to always start a fresh song before recording. But this is easier said than done, and it won't help if you've already got a huge session which needs splitting up. So if you have a computer, you can rename the master file after each mix so it doesn't get overwritten, or you could copy it to the computer if you're short of space on the SD card. And if you haven't got a computer, you'll have to split the song into multiple songs somehow, say by using the copy song function. There's a copy there, and deleting parts if you're short on space. Okay, so why do I keep referring to the Mixdown as a one-way process? And it's all because the master file cannot be played back in normal multitrack mode, which means you cannot go back and edit the mix, say to add a fade in or a fade out, or add an overall reverb to the whole thing. You can only recreate the mix from scratch, which means doing the Mixdown again, and this will overwrite your previous mix. Now you cannot even play this file back in Mixdown mode, which is where you created it in the first place. So now maybe you can appreciate the simplicity of bouncing instead of Mixdown. The only way to play back the master file to review it is by entering mastering mode, which is the next mode you go to when you press the Mixdown mastering button. See, the light now stays on and the screen has gone to mastering. Now there is another way of getting at the master file, but only if you have a computer. I'll look at this later. Now it's not too clear on the diagram, but there's enough to show you that when you are in mastering mode and press play, the master file goes to the stereo outputs. So you can review it with the monitor if it's set to stereo. But note that the signal does not go through the stereo fader this time. So this control has no effect on the playback level. You can also see that none of the other multi-track controls, the track faders, EQ, the pan and effects, are anywhere near this path. The only things on the path are the mastering effects. So you must turn these off if you just want to review your Mixdown. And if you're not happy with it, you can undo it, but there is only one level of undo. So you can only compare the two most recent mixes. Even if you've got your undo levels set to 10 in the preferences, that only applies to multitrack mode. Now another possible catch, if you stay in Mixdown and press rewind then play, thinking that you can review your mix, all you are hearing are the original track and input signals you used to create the mix. This can be very deceptive if you're just starting out, especially if you've added effects to the mix. When you press play, it may seem as if it's the mix result, as you'll hear all the effects again, but it is not. The only way to hear your mix is to press the Mixdown mastering button again to enter mastering mode. Even though you're not going to master, you make sure the effects are off, then you can press play and review your mix. Okay, you're finally happy with the mix, so how do you master it? Well, you go to mastering mode. As we've seen, if you're in Mixdown mode, you just press the button. If you're in multi-track mode, you'll need to press it twice. And once you're in the correct mode, pressing play does what we've just seen. The master file plays back through the mastering effects, if they're on, and then out to the stereo outputs and your monitor. Again, the stereo fader has no effect. So this is how you would preview the effect settings. Now these are different effects to the ones we've been looking at. They're all here on this one screen. There's an EQ, a compressor, and a normalizing function. And we'll leave this function till last. So while the master file is playing, you can adjust the EQ and compressor settings as required. and when you're happy, press record. And there's no need to set the in and out points, as the whole master file is going to be processed. The total time is shown here. And as with Mixdown, there's no need to press stop. The machine stops automatically. If you override this and press stop, you'll end up with a short master file. And the diagram shows the signal plays back through the effects and goes back into the box where it overwrites the previous master file. This obviously destroys the original contents, but like the Mixdown, the machine keeps one level of backup for undo purposes. And once you've mastered the file, you just stay in mastering mode, and you can simply review the result by pressing play again. But, another catch, you must turn off the two effects, otherwise the signal will pass through these a second time, giving you a false impression of what the result sounds like. So whether you press play or record in mastering mode, the signal will always go through these two effects. So you need to make sure they're off if you don't need them. Now you can apply both EQ and compression in a single pass, or you can apply them separately. If you're going to do them one at a time, you need to press record for each pass. Now these passes are in real time, and the result can be heard from the stereo outputs or the monitor while it's mastering. And the third effect, normalization, must only be run as the last operation on the master file. It processes the file offline without actually playing it, so it's a lot quicker than the other two effects. And as the graphic shows, it increases the signal level such that the loudest peaks in your file are at the maximum possible level. Now again, this process also overwrites the master file. Once you've normalized, you should not do any more processing on the file. If you do, the signal may distort. Right, so you've made your master file. How do you transfer it to a computer? Well, this is a lot easier and quicker than transferring tracks. The export function is not needed. You don't need to do anything on the machine, apart from maybe switching on the USB link. The file lives in the song folder, so you just copy the file from there. It has a sensible name based on the song name. The only potential confusion is that you may see another file which has a similar name but with an extra Z character. This is the backup file. So you would normally leave this alone as the contents are not guaranteed. It could be a Mixdown file or a mastered file depending on what you did last. And finally, I'll just mop up a couple of points mentioned earlier. Firstly, how to go back and reprocess the master file. Now the file is just a normal stereo WAV file, so there's nothing to stop you copying the file from the song folder back into the audio depot folder and then importing it to a track. You obviously need a computer or a device which allows you to access the card and copy files. But if you do this, you could then say reprocess a mix or apply the mastering effect to a single track and so on. And lastly, I'll just clarify a point which sometimes crops up with track edit. How to set the 3 time locations which are needed for some functions, such as move and paste. The start and end times of the section to copy are simple enough. They're the in and out points, which you set with these buttons. We've seen that before. It's the third one, the target to time, which is the start time of the destination. It's not so obvious, but it's just the current location. This is shown at the top of the screen. So before you go into the function, set the in and out points, and then set your current location using the jog wheel or the forward and rewind buttons. Go to track edit and they'll be set up. Okay, well, that about wraps it up for this whole tutorial. If anything else crops up, I'll maybe add some more videos to the playlist. so if you subscribe you should get a notification if that happens. Now I know I've skipped quite a few things, but the intention was to give you enough information and guidance so you could work things out yourself and continue exploring the machine without getting frustrated or tearing your hair out because of the various quirks. As the old saying goes, it's better to show how to fish than to just give out food. Now this approach may have seemed overly complicated. You can probably tell my background is electronics and computing, so apologies if it put you off, but I would always recommend you try and get as many viewpoints as possible. So watch other videos, browse the internet, the forums and so on, and hopefully something will resonate with you. If you still need answers, I can recommend the Tascam forum, where there are far more knowledgeable people than me, and some who actually do this for a living, so I'm sure they can fill in the gaps and explain things like how to actually use a compressor or give practical advice on mixing and mastering. And if all else fails, you can still contact me via the email shown on my Philisound website, and I'll do my best to help. But for now, I'd just like to thank everyone for their encouragement and support, especially those who are even kind enough to make donations. It's very much appreciated and made all those hours of scripting, recording and editing worthwhile. So, maybe for the last time, I hope it's helped, and thanks for watching.